And tonight we are visited by Dr. Leif Richardson, who is a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And there he leads the California Bumble Bee Atlas, which we are going to learn about tonight. And that is a community science project to inventory the native bees of the state. He's going to get into it in much more detail. So his primary responsibility is including training volunteers, obtaining permits, field inventory, species identification, fundraising. He does it all. But his research focuses on the ecology, distribution, and declines of North American bumblebees. I know we love those fluffy guys. Dr. Richardson previously worked as an environmental consultant, studying pesticide risk to bee pollinators and as an ecologist for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. He's also a co-author of a range of scientific publications on bees, including Bumblebees of North America, an identification guide. Go check that out, as well as the standard reference manual on this group of insects. He's an expert in the inventory and identification of bumblebees and has extensive experience training others to collect bumblebee distribution data in the field. Take it away, Leif.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. Great. I'm so glad to be here talking to you all tonight. I want to say first that I just really enjoyed the plant and bee sharing just now, and it reminds me that I like to tell people, as much as I like bumblebees, there are a lot of other bees in the air, and they're just so many cool ones. So it's nice to see what you guys are finding. I have not been outside often enough in the last month, so now I'm gonna have to go to Anza right away. One of my favorite places. All right. So I'm going to talk about the California Bumblebee Atlas. If you happen to catch me at CNPS last month, this is going to be similar to what I talked about there. Um, and so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what the Atlas is, what we do, how we do it. And for some of you, this will be review because you are participants. I'm also going to show you some data from the project. So what have we learned so far? And in particular, I'm going to focus on the host plants. So typically we kind of gloss over the plant diversity that we were seeing in the survey. But I spent some time drilling down on pattern and stuff, and I think you'll find it kind of interesting to see. All right, so let me just see if I can get my slides to move. Okay. So I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I'm not here on the job at the moment, but I thought I'd just remind people because I'm talking about the Bumblebee Atlas. It's a conservation nonprofit where we protect invertebrates and their habitats. Most people know us for our work with bumblebees and butterflies, but we also work with all of the other bees, all of the other butterflies, at least in Western North America, and on an array of other invertebrates, including freshwater mussels and fireflies. There's all kinds of cool community science to get involved in if that's your thing. So go to xerces.org and check it out if you're interested. Tonight I'll be talking about bumblebees. We all know them and love them, but here is the general background for those who are new to the whole thing. They are social insects with an annual life cycle. Social means they live in social contexts, actually family groups where there's a lot of interaction, a lot of communication, and shared work that results in better outcomes in terms of reproductive fitness and that sort of thing, at least in certain kinds of environments. And so I say they're annuals in the sense that the colonies are initiated in springtime and they fall apart, they die in summer or fall. And all of the bees produced in a season are going to die except for females who have mated and go to hibernation. We call them gines at that point, but they're the next year's queens. And so there isn't a continuous population of males and females in different castes. That is the case with honeybees, for example, where you have queens who can live for multiple years. But here, it starts over every spring or whatever. California spring is kind of a squishy topic, but yeah, they could start in December, it could start in March, but the point is that they're annuals. It's really important to understand that they have these symbioses with plants. Another thing I don't have to tell you guys, but for bumblebees, there's two kinds of food for the most part. There's pollen and there's nectar. and they both come from flowers. So they're tightly tied to flowers, as are so many other bees, most other bees. They do eat some other weird stuff that I love to talk about, but I'll skip it for now. They're not highly diverse. We only have 25 species in the entire state, and that's contrasted with 1,600 plus of the other types of bees here. I like to tell people that bumblebees are generalists, where up to 20 to 40% of the others are specialists on pollen sources, but we'll get into some nuance around that in a minute. So, why focus on insects? Why are we even here tonight instead of watching TV with our loved ones or reading a book or whatever it is we do at night when we're not at a meeting? I mean, there's the biophilia side of it. We all love insects. It just intrinsically, at least speaking for myself, I think nature's pretty cool. But really importantly, so many of these things are starting to decline, and we have limited data for many taxa, including most bees. But for those bees where we do have information, like bumblebees, we see a worrying pattern where as much as about 25% of all of them are imperiled. They're either uncommon, like Crotch's bumblebee, or they're possibly extinct, like Franklin's bumblebee, or somewhere in between in most cases. So 1 in 4 is not a good ratio. Um, that is not a sustainable kind of loss, I would say. I saw a talk today using occupancy modeling methods to answer that same question of like how many bees are rare or whatever. And these people decided it was more like 40% of all North American bumblebees were imperiled, um, which was a bit higher than I was used to. But I'm not going to read the rest of this slide. But the point here is that we have these declines, and so we're focusing money and labor and other efforts at trying to understand what's going on. As I said, California has 25 documented native bumblebee species, one non-native. Does anyone know what the non-native is? You all know what it is, probably. Common eastern bumblebee. We have not detected it in our work, the California Bumble Bee Atlas, but there's a number of observations, mainly around tomato greenhouses in Tehachapi and Slow County and this general vicinity of the state, where they're used as commercial greenhouse pollinators of tomatoes. 8 of these 25 species are species of greatest conservation need, according to California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There were 6 of them, but every 5 years, these state wildlife action plans are renewed. And this year, CDFW has added 2 additional species to the list. So the species that are considered of greatest conservation need here in California are the fogpelt bumblebee, Crotch's bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, high country bumblebee, Morrison's, western, Sonoran, and Suckley. And there are photos of all of them there from left to right in the same order as the bulleted list. Um, and let's see, so one of these is federally listed as endangered. That's Franklin's. Several are also candidates for listing at the federal level. Occidentalis would already be on the list, if not for human stuff. Um, and I think it's likely we'll eventually see Suckley's on the list as well, since it's missing in the United States entirely. It is still found in Western Canada. And then 4 of them are CISA candidates. So CISA is California's Endangered Species Act, and while they're candidates, they're protected as if they were listed as endangered or threatened. And those are Crotchii, Franklini, Occidentalis, and Sucklei. And Crotchii is the only one where, or Crotch's is the only one where we have this nexus with human activity and repeated um, um, efforts to protect the bee from development or succeed with development despite the presence of the bee, these kinds of things. So there have been lots of conflicts between Crotch's bumblebee and what I'll call progress, quotes, in California in the last couple of years. So the data I'm going to present here and the project I'm going to talk about is part of the broader Bumblebee Atlas project at Xerces. We're doing this in 21 US states, and they're colored in blue there. We've added 1 new state this year, and that's New Mexico. We're excited about this project getting off the ground. And I would say a goal generally is to do this everywhere. Although some states have already had good, thorough atlases in the last decade, and we wouldn't be repeating those right away. And that includes Maine, Vermont, probably Ohio and Alaska. I think Michigan also. In Wisconsin, I believe. Anyway, okay. So we have lots of these different projects, and wherever we work with in-state partners and also the federal government. And this is community science, as you'll hear more about in a minute. So the whole thing runs on volunteer labor and donated mileage. So it's pretty wonderful when you start looking at the volume of information we've been able to produce um, with I mean, we're funded by federal agencies for the most part. People like me get paid a paycheck, but for the most part, this is due to volunteer labor. And so I think you should keep that in mind as I talk about what we've accomplished so far. We are doing non-lethal sampling of bumblebees. There isn't a lot of evidence that lethal sampling leads to population changes in any bees, and there have been some efforts to understand this. Nonetheless, I guess we don't feel like that's conclusive, and also it's a bad look to be killing bees while trying to save them. And I think I think in some ways we can just explain that to the general public and policymakers and stuff. But even when you succeed in getting it right and really explain the need to kill these things in order to save them, it just rings hollow. I don't think people really well, anyway, so this is just one of the reasons that we are doing this in a non-lethal manner. It's possible to identify bumblebees from good photos. And so basically what we're doing is we have a standardized protocol where people will do 45 minutes of collecting effort where they swing a net at any bumblebee they see. If they catch a bee, they transfer it to a vial, and then the vial goes in the cooler. And it stays there for up to 2 hours, after which time it is knocked out, like the bee in the bottom right-hand photo there. And you have between 2 and 10 or 15 minutes to handle it, to spread its wings manually, to turn it over and get good side photos and all this good stuff. And they just wake up and fly away from your notebook when they're ready. It's actually kind of like it's a little like LAX. When you get working fast, there's just like bees taking off all over the place. It's fun. Um, uh, I should have said we are careful to sanitize our equipment between sites. We're trying not to unwittingly spread pathogens between different populations of bees through our equipment, which is a real possibility. Um, it turns out that with this method, the voucher of observation is a photo. It's not a dead bee that we can put in a museum drawer somewhere. And if someone else disagrees that we saw it, they can go check the specimen. We don't have a specimen. We don't have anything physical. So what we have is a digital photograph, right? Or five of them. And that means that I end up teaching. I'm not a professional photographer, but I end up teaching photography quite a bit while training people to do this project. These are all examples of pretty good photos, good enough photos for ID, I would say. And you all have lots of experience identifying smaller stuff from photos only, so you understand what I'm talking about. But I like them even better than this. I like to tell people that we do not need to see the entire animal in high res focus, but if there's some part of the animal that's of interest to us for identification where we can see individual hairs, that's probably a good photo. And so these are all decent photos in terms of being able to distinguish where there are black hairs invading the yellow or red and the length of the cheek and this kind of thing. So photography is a really big part of what we do. We do not require that people get fancy cameras. I, in fact, use a cell phone for almost all of what I do, and it's adequate. It's more than adequate for what we're doing. So there's no great cost that is necessary to incur to participate here. Now I'm going to talk a little about what we've learned. So this is a data summary in the next several slides. We started in 2022, and each year we attract people to the project. We train them through online training workshops. They have to take a short quiz afterwards. They're added to a scientific collecting permit with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, something that is hard to obtain on one's own. Can take up to a year or two. And our SCP, as it's known by its acronym, is not transferable to any other use. You can't be an environmental scientist who is doing their on-the-job work under our permit and also volunteering for the project. But the SCP is an important license that we have to do this work, and it's probably the largest SCP that CDFW has ever issued. I'm guessing here we have almost 2,000 people named on the permit. So, and we keep adding them as we keep training them. So far we've got nearly 25,000 independent bumblebee observations, made over 2,700 standardized surveys. So that's those 45-minute survey efforts where we can make apples to apples comparisons across different parts of the state because we use the same methods. And even if one person worked for an hour instead of 45 minutes, we can just adjust the abundance of bees that they found or the diversity of bees they found by the number of minutes of survey effort, right? So we can get everybody doing the same thing using a little simple math. We have failed to find two of the historically known species, Suckleys and Franklins, and we're not done looking. So I still remain hopeful, at least for Franklins. And we've trained, yeah, more like 1,800 people now, but those are all folks who are on the permit. The map shows all of the data, all of the observations of bees, and there's a lot of stacking of points in that picture. You can see that there's a pretty good dispersal across the state of two places where bumblebees occur. We are not doing a lot of work in the Sonoran Desert because we have other priorities basically, and you're very unlikely to find any bumblebees in Imperial County. They could be there, at least maybe right now they could be just on the western edge of the county or something. But point is that we're trying to disperse people throughout the rest of the state, and you can clearly see where people live on this map, right? San Diego, LA, Bay Area, Eureka, they light right up. But still, we're sending people quite some distance away from the usual places of collecting. If you're interested in exploring the data, we put it all on bumblebeewatch.org, and it's easy to query according to year or species or sex or this kind of county, state, that sort of thing. So if you want to think about getting involved, go look at Bumblebee Watch and you'll see it's our it's our analogy to iNaturalist, I'll say. It's like that, except it's just for bumblebee data. Um, I want to emphasize again that the volunteers are the linchpin of this whole thing. And the graph here is just showing the number of new participants, SCP permittees each year in the bluish color. And then the dull green there is the number of people who submitted data. So many more people go through the effort of joining the project than actually end up submitting data. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But one of my priorities each year, this time of year, is to try to convert those people who do not submit data, but who are permitted to doing so. So I'm trying to find the time to write a targeted email to those folks and invite them to get involved more. But the point is, here's a pair of friends of mine up in Eureka who are doing some survey work, and that's their free time, and they're doing this. The amount of hours and miles that have been donated, it's literally millions of dollars. So I don't know. I may be overemphasizing this point, but in a world like the one we live in, I just find it really stunning and wonderful that people to get together can make all of these small contributions and do something big like this, through what is fundamentally altruistic, sort of community building effort, as opposed to trying to make money on something or profit in some way, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the bees that we are seeing. This is our most common bumblebee statewide. It's Vosnesensky bumblebee, and that's Mount Shasta in the background, looking amazing. And that was in Sisson Meadow last summer, this place in Shasta City. And so what we do is we make all these observations, then we analyze the data, and in this case, we're asking what is the frequency of a species in a collection event? So in a 45-minute effort, what proportion of the bees that you caught were made up by this bee, this species, that species. And I've plotted a lot of data on this one graph. So all 4 years of the study are there for every one of the species, which are on the y-axis, the vertical axis. And then its frequency. So again, it's like the percent of the total number of bees caught that were accounted for by this one. I control for multiple collections of the same species here. So in some cases, somebody will be in an amazing patch of just the right flower, star thistle, and they'll get like 70 crotches bumblebees in 45 minutes. We don't want to use the raw number 40 in an analysis like this. It makes crotches look super abundant, right? maybe that's the wrong example. I should say Vosensensky, a common one anyway. We want to downweight in that case because we don't want to take this one super survey and make it reflective of the whole state, which it is not. Anyway, so the point here is just that you don't need to understand all of the data in this graph, but that we do see some species becoming more common each year of our study and others becoming less common. And most of them are really not very common in our study at all. They're under 2% of the bees that we find. And that's the ones that I pulled out in this little inset. So more than half of them are uncommon in the survey efforts. And this is lumping everything statewide. So, Pennsylvanicus, that's the code name for Sonoran bumblebee here. That one, it can be locally quite abundant in San Diego and along the south coast, but it is utterly absent from most of the state. So it appears rare in part because it's being averaged over the entire state's data set here. I want to now get into talking about the plants stuff. So, for every bumblebee that someone observes via photography, they tell us what plant species they collected it from, if they did. And so here's a picture of, I think this is Pennsylvanicus, and it's not from California. And that's a monarda or bee balm flower. And I think everybody probably knows what pollination is, but I like to put us all on the same page here because we often hear real educated and experienced people kind of glossing over what it really means. It doesn't mean landing on a flower, right? It means effectuating plant reproduction or ovule fertilization. So not all flower visits are pollinating visits. Some of them, the bee fails to move pollen around between male and female sex parts. Sometimes the bee acts in such a way that she benefits from the interaction, but the plant actually experiences a detriment. They damage the flower in some kind of way, right? So not all visits are pollination. And that's important to understand or remember as you ingest the information I'm about to show you. But what is pollination? Just so we're all on the same page, here is a lovely bee on a flower. The dangly bits coming out of the corollas there are the male and female parts of the flowers, right? And pollination is moving pollen grains from the male anthers to the female stigmas. And they're not doing this intentionally. It's a passive part of their foraging. And in fact, you can see pollen on the forehead of this bee that the plant has skillfully deposited right there as the bee entered the flower to get nectar, right? So pollination would be her next visit. She's going to deposit some of that pollen passively as she goes into a flower. So there's pollination, the mutualism, where both partners are benefiting. The bee gets food, the plant gets help with reproduction, right? But let's keep in mind that that's not always the outcome of these interactions. So here is a high level look at the plants that the bees in the California Bumble Bee Atlas work have been visiting. This is the top 10 plant genera for bumblebees in California, according to our work, starting with salvia, phacelia, lupins, vetches, and that number 4, vetches, that is mainly the non-native vetches, monardella, poppies, thistles, buckwheat, deerweed, and penstemon. In fact, we have almost 500 different genera of California plants that have been documented as hosts to bumblebees. Bumblebees are generalists in terms of the kinds of food they take. When we talk about this with bees, generalists versus specialists, we're specifically talking about pollen, the pollen diet. But we can say it about nectar as well. So they eat all sorts of different things. And 500 genera represents many thousands of plants, right? We until this 2025, we did not. Ooh, that's very bright. We, until 2025, we did not record the plant species. We only recorded the genus. And just in last year, we got almost 1,000 plant species associations reported. So we know it's many more plants than that. So bumblebees are real widespread pollen generalists on California's native plants. But they really like some non-natives like Vicia americana, Vicia villosum, I think it is, a number of thistles, right? And related plants like star thistle. So native plants are super important for these bees as well as for all of the other native solitaries and other bees. But let's keep in mind that to a bumblebee, a host plant is neither native nor non-native. It is not a concept that they recognize, so far as we understand. And so we should continue our efforts to put native plants on the landscape, but we should pay attention to bumblebees eating non-native things and react accordingly. So don't level the weeds during the flowering period when they're covered in bumblebees would be maybe one thing I would say about it. Finally, this is a reflection of the bees' preference for different flowers, but is it? It's where we saw the bees taking nectar and pollen from flowers, and we call that preference. But it isn't really a head-to-head comparison between salvia and phacelia or something else. There are other options in every field site, but we're not doing experimental work where we're really giving them a head-to-head option. So I'll use the word preference, but you can remember that it's a sticky issue, and it could involve other factors besides just what the bee is really interested in eating today. This is data looking at the Bumblebee Atlas nationwide in those 21, well, 20 of those 21 states. So this is a more high level look at what bumblebees eat across North America. Monarda or bee balm is the number one by far plant. And then some of the heavy hitters from California are also there, Cercium and Salvia. And if you look down the list, you'll see many others that are important here in California. This is like the top 20 or something, but of course there are 608 vertical rows in this table, so in this graph. So this is just the most important ones. As with other ways of analyzing plant use by generalist bees, there is a long tail of singletons or these sort of rare associations between the bee that's a generalist and some obscure flower, right? Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say about this one. Uh, so I've said that they're generalists a bunch of times. They're pollen generalists, but it's important to understand from the perspective of management or restoration, or anyone who cares about bee persistence and conservation, that they're not all alike, and there is nuance to what they're eating. So this is that same setup. It's frequency across the x-axis, and it's plant genera across the y. And I have two bees to compare here: crotches, the one that's uncommon, and black-tailed or melanopagus, the one that's very common in early spring and early summer, but uh, fades out in dry years by June or something. And crotches is endemic in California almost entirely, and melanopagus or melanopagus is found broadly in the West. And what I want you to notice here is how starkly different their diets are. And this data set is filtered to only include bee observations from the same geography where both species could have occurred. So you can see Asclepias or milkweed is heavily favored by Crotch's bumblebee. 16% or more of all of our observations take place on this one plant. If you want to see Crotch's bumblebee, the best thing to do would be go find a milkweed plant, right? By contrast, a black-tailed bumblebee never used it, not once. And we have hundreds of records of that bee foraging during the time when milkweeds are flowering, right? So it just is not their dietary preference. And I'll talk more about why that might be in a couple slides here. By contrast, Ceanothus is really important to spring-flying black-tailed bumblebees. And it's among the most common photos you'll see on iNaturalist of this bee is it running all over a nice Ceanothus bloom from like the Bay Area or something. Cautious bumblebee is active at the same time. Never used it, not once. So this isn't to say that, oh, they are in fact specialists. It's to tell you that these two species, when they co-occur, they are eating different things. And so to properly conserve bumblebees generally, we need to think more about individual species needs. And I've left this blank on the right side of the frame because I wanted to show you that we can break it down even further and find all kinds of nuance there as well. So just taking crotches and dividing it between males and females, the females including workers and queens, we see really different patterns of floral use by the two sexes. If you look at the bottom of the graph, you see Asclepias again. So that's the number one plant for this species. And it looks like males are more responsible for that pattern than females. Almost 30% of all of our observations of male crotchets bumblebees have been foraging on milkweed. And by contrast, you see things like Schultzia, which is a California poppy, or lupins. We've never seen a male Crotchets bumblebee on those plants. The reason is that those are pollen sources for Crotchets bumblebee, and the males are not gathering pollen, right? This isn't rocket science. I'm not revealing some ancient secret here, but we don't think about this stuff. We don't talk about it anyway when we talk about ecological restoration or taking care of bee habitats and bees. And so again, this is not specialization. It's not oligolecty. Um, that's the cool stuff that solitary bees do more of. But I do think it's important for us all to understand that there's nuance and complexity all over the place with these really common, easy to observe and appreciate bees. So let's talk more about milkweed. I think milkweeds are some of the most fascinating plants we have in California, and that is saying something given the diversity of the plants here. So there's this thing that we've known about for 75 years or more, the fact that milkweeds are toxic, that their foliage is toxic. It contains cardinalides or cardiac glycosides, which are really gnarly chemicals. They interact with the voltage gated channels of cells. Basically, your cells doing the basic border stuff of moving positively and negatively charged ions back and forth. You can't survive without that function in your cells, and this stuff blocks it. So it's kind of special that monarch butterflies can eat these things. And what those caterpillars are doing is they're actually sequestering the toxins in their body. They're kind of holding them separate from the rest of their cells. This stuff is toxic to monarch butterflies as well. In fact, we know this because female monarchs will they'll land on multiple milkweeds and they'll taste the leaves and they'll choose to oviposit on the relatively less defended milkweed plants, so relatively lower concentrations of the chemicals. Um, and this is because their offspring are harmed by the same chemicals that protect them from predators and parasitoids through this really cool sequestration thing that butterflies and moths can do. Bumblebees do not sequester these chemicals, so far as we know. There has never been a report of that in any plant system with bumblebees or other bees at all. But there is this one paper from the lab of Anurag Agrawal at Cornell that's really cool. It looked at, there's a couple of papers, but they look at the presence of these chemicals in the nectar of the plants. And you may be aware that milkweeds, they kind of keep their pollen separate in these little packages called pollinia, and bees generally aren't foraging for the pollen of these plants. They can't access it. So they're there for nectar only. And we know that there is this toxic nectar compound in the nectar of some species, but not others. So I took a look at our bumblebee data from California, and I adjusted it according to the commonness of each species in the data set, and then just graphed it this way, showing the subgenera. And what you can see is that one subgenus is pretty stoked about milkweed nectar. That's the Callimannobombus, and the rest of them, they either avoid it entirely or there's a few observations in the data set. It's really they're not the biggest thing that they like to eat. So this got me thinking, that's interesting. Most of the Callimannobombus seem to be really fond of this one plant in California, some of some of which are toxic to them. So then I looked at one species, Crotch's bumblebee, and the photo of the human beings in this picture depicts two people on the call. That's Dev Kopp, who I noticed was in the Zoom tonight. So hi, Dev. We were up in the San Bernardinos with our friend Arlie doing some work on catching Crotch's bumblebee on Asclepias areocarpa. That's the photo of the bees and the plant there. It turns out that Asclepias areocarpa is, of all the milkweeds in Central and South America, it is the one that may have the highest concentrations of toxic cardinalides in the nectar. And Crotch's bumblebee is a big fan of this plant. We found, you can see a bunch of narked out bees in that photo, I think it's partially covered for me. And those guys all came off of basically one individual plant, maybe two or three plants out in the middle of this field, just to make the case that it wasn't just a lot of hard work. They were going crazy for this plant. They also use fascicularis or narrow-leaved milkweed quite a lot, and research shows that there is no toxic cardinalide chemical in the nectar of fascicularis. So that one makes sense. So what we see here is that the plants that they are foraging on, the sort of number one milkweed for California's bumblebees, at least for this species, sorry, is Areocarpa, the really toxic one. And it's not just a little toxic. We are talking about, um, human beings can die from eating this stuff, and it's just a very toxic chemical. So I'm not trying to get you to think that maybe there's some special benefit they're getting out of it. It's possible. I don't think they're sequestering it. I don't think this is the cause of the imperilment of Crouch's bumblebee, or any other bumblebees. I don't have the answer at all. But I think this is really cool, and I think you guys should just see this, that all around us with these bee plant interactions that we're so fond of, we see bees ingesting plant chemicals that are medicinal, toxic, hallucinogenic, that have other sorts of properties that affect bee life and reproductive outcomes and so on. It's really important to understand that beyond the sugars of nectar and the protein of pollen, bees are getting all sorts of other cool stuff out of plants, um, and some of it matters to outcomes for bees. All right. So one more slide about milkweed. I took that same idea. I looked at all of our data across the US from the Bumble Bee Atlas project and graphed it the same way I showed you that slide a few slides back. And the point here was just to look at whether the subgenera are also behaving the same way at a national level. And what we see is that Cullimana bombus is still the one that most prefers milkweed, with Crotch's bumblebee way ahead of all of the others. There's one other subgenus that seems to like it a lot, and that is the subgenus Bombus, which includes the rusty patch and Bombus terricola, or yellow-belted bumblebee, another species of conservation concern. In fact, there are 7 species of conservation concern on this graph, and 6 of them are right up at the top of the list. So again, I'm not trying to say this is why they're rare or why they're not rare or whatever, but this obviously matters to the life history of a bunch of rare and declining species. So do with that what you will. I want to move on now to talking about another thing that I think is important about bumblebees. And again, bumblebees just being representative of bees in general, they pollinate a lot of our rarest plants. So it's always fun to go look at an Eriogonum fasciculatum and see the bumblebees and other bees visiting. But what's really cool to me is that, we have this amazing plant diversity here in this state, and many of those really rare species are being visited, if not pollinated, by these bumblebees. So in our data set, I was able to find 125 bee plant interactions that happen one or more times across 68 plant genera, where bumblebees are visiting federally or state listed species or globally rare species. This is not to say they're the pollinators. Please remember what I said about pollination and mutualism. But here's a nice example from a beach, one of 2 beaches on Earth where you can see this plant in Mendocino County. It's Collinsia corymbosa. And we have some nice bumblebee observations on this plant by some volunteers who live in that area. And I like to, so we don't know that it's the pollinator, but it is at least a forager here. So we don't even know that this is a mutualist of this rare plant. I'm going to assume it's probably important to the rare plant to some degree. But I wanted to say that when we talk about bees, we often end up trying to convince people that they're valuable. We tell stories, the fact-based stories, they're real, right? They're true, but we tell stories to validate the fact that we think these are important animals. And they are, no question. I am not questioning this. I think the utilitarian value of bees and bumblebees being just one type is super important. And that is reason enough to go outside and try to take care of them. But let's remember that they have, to many of us, they have intrinsic value as native species that occur here, as components of our ecosystems, and we don't need to validate them as quote unquote good. We don't have to we don't have to attack them as bad. If I was talking to you about herbivores and I showed this slide, I'd say, look at all these rare plants that these herbivores are chewing on. Isn't that amazing? And you would wonder if I was okay, right? Because I'd be talking about these plants we want to conserve being killed by these bugs that I care about. So it's not just because they're good guys that we should care about them, is what I'm saying. And there's this fascinating little natural history tidbit for this story about Collinsia corymbosa, and that is that if you read the status assessment prepared by the federal government before listing this plant, they decided that one of the chief threats to the plant was hybridism with another more common species of Collinsia that co-occurs on those beaches. So now the floral visitors, the pollinators, could actually be part of the problem. So I'm not saying in fact, bumblebees are bad. I hope you follow me here. I just want us to think about um, bees as members of the natural world community that we co-occur with, and in all of their varied traits, including those that where good and bad is not really discernible or is not really the point. So anyway, there's a strong connection to rare plants in California, and no doubt they are important pollinators of many of those plants. Um, we have some sort of ephemera from the project that I love to talk about, and I could go on for days about some of this stuff. I just have a few slides to share with you about this. One of them is the fact that bumblebees often use nectarless wind-pollinated plants. This is Plantago lanceolata, the non-native Plantago, one of two or three species we have in the state that are non-native. Bumblebees love this pollen, and they sonicate these flowers to get it. And the photo on the left, you can actually see pollen grains whipping off of the flowers as the bee sonicates the plant. These are from a volunteer for the project. Of course, bumblebees sonicate all kinds of stuff, as do most, well, I would say at least 50% of the genera of bees in California are capable of sonication. There's just a wide diversity of bees that can do it. Honeybees don't, but it is a common thing we see with bumblebees. And sometimes they're using grasses or plantago or other things like this that they're not supposed to be eating, according to pollination syndrome thinking and the fact that these are wind pollinated plants. Yeah, I circled the pollen grains to help there. Um, I think it's important to say this regularly. Bees are pollinators of so many important California plants, and that includes economically important plants. Um, Economic meaning connected to people in the sense of economic botany. So, traditional food, fiber, and medicine plants of indigenous people in California, as well as many non-traditional foods or non-native traditional foods, such as the almond in the bottom left. These are all really important plants to people. Yampa in the upper left, geophytes like the one in the middle there. I can't remember what genus that is. Manzanita, chia, datura over here on the right, a very important ceremonial and medicinal plant for many California native groups. So, bees pollinate flowers, big deal. But I think it's important to remember that these bees are also part of this picture about how human beings have lived here in California, what is now called California, for literally for thousands of years. So thank you, bees. Now I have a little funny little story that I think you'll enjoy. Um, and so we have tons of bees in this data set of 24,000 plus, where there's weird stuff going on their heads. And here's a sampling. Look at all these guys with these lumpy, knobby pollen crusts on their antenna, particularly on the scape and the pedicel of the antenna. This stuff is hard. It's kind of like resin or wax, and it definitely has pollen in it, but it is not only pollen. We were trying to figure out what is this? What's going on here? Why are so many bees having this? Um, Somebody sequenced some of it and at UC Riverside, and I think they determined that it had lupin pollen in it. So that's why lupin is the picture in the middle there. Maybe there's some species of lupin that's doing something weird with the bees, right? So I decided to look into this, and one reason is that the antenna of bees are not just a couple of sticks sticking off the head. These things are sensory apparati that just they do so many different things. There's like 5 to 10 different sensory modalities on the antenna of these bees. And these are some graphics from a cool paper that looks at bumblebee antenna and maps for different species and sexes where all of these things are. And so the scape and the pedestal of the antenna are super important for navigation, for smell, for sensing vibrations, for other stuff. So it stands to reason that if bees are coming away from their day of foraging on plants with this kind of issue, they're probably less able to sense their environment. And it seems like maybe that would impact their foraging behavior or their ability to get home or something. So I started looking at our data to try to figure out what this was. And these are all the bee species or taxa where we recorded the stuff. So every time I see one, I put it in a spreadsheet, and we have hundreds of records now. And the colors in the bars are different plant species. And the gray one, the big one, is Salvia mellifera. just one single species. It's black sage. So that doesn't mean it's what's causing this problem, but it does seem to be a consistent pattern that most of the bee, most of the taxa here, uh, Salvia mellifera is one of the host plants that's recorded in bees that have this. Some of them it is not present, or it's not the plant that they were visiting. But if we dig down into the data from the survey, we find out the plant was on site. So I decided to look at a couple of other ways of understanding this question. So I got flowering data from the California Herbarium Consortium. I think that's what it's called. It's an amazing data set that can show you when plants are flowering and things like this. And of course, the temporally, salvia lines right up with these bumblebees that were getting gunked. And then the map just shows you where the same salvia mellifera observations took place in that data set. And of course, there's spatial overlap. So I don't know that it's this, but I've seen this on honeybees foraging at black sage. I've seen it on a lot of bumblebees. Again, we don't know anything about it. It's not described in the literature. I've read every paper about salvia pollination that exists, and none of them talk about this. They do talk about the bumblebees, but they do not mention this. So there's just a fun little bumblebee mystery for us to think about and maybe pursue in the future. So, final thoughts. Native plant conservation is equivalent to native bee conservation in both directions, in my view. Um, they are partners in this, and so we see a lot of cool pattern in the plant data from this native bee bumblebee atlas, but um, it's hard to talk about, to me, to talk about just taking care of plant communities without thinking about the pollinators and the herbivores and so on. And the inverse is also true. So I think bumblebees are an important member of the bee community here in California, if a minor one, and they're pollinators probably of a number of native invasive crop and culturally important plants. So with that, I will say thank you for your attention. And here are a couple of links, including some screen thingies here for Bumblebee Watch, which I introduced already, for a data dashboard. So this is on a different website called bumblebeeatlas.org, and that is the website for our project. And that dashboard will allow you to play with the data, and you can segment it by state and bee species and this kind of thing. Our data goes to GBIF once or twice a year. There are quicker ways to get a hold of it if you need the data. Get in touch. But there's a link to our repository at GBIF. And we would love to have you join us in this project if you're interested and you're not already involved. So there's the website at the bottom, bumblebeeatlas.org, and you can easily find the California page at the website. And we are doing our first training in 2 days on Thursday evening. So if you're interested in that, I will drop a link in the chat in a second for registration. And I'd love to see you there.